Good morning, everybody.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. We started in the morning, this afternoon already. Welcome to our discussion on grow your own and why we need to grow our own in particular. This is the first of a 4 workshop series. Okay, we're gonna have this discussion go from seed to table, all the way from why we should be growing our food, how we can grow food and live off of the land. And then we're actually at the end gonna cook some food. We'll have a cooking demonstration. We'll do some things to prepare it. My name is Micaiah. I am known as Micaiah the pharmacist. We own Free Haven Farms. We're located in Lawnside, New Jersey. We farm in a specific kind of manner. It's called regenerative agriculture. So we farm in a way that we build up the ecosystem. It's in accordance with nature. We don't use any chemicals. We find it important not to use pesticides. So anyways, let me stop and just introduce myself and let my wife introduce herself.
Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Cynthia Hall, the other half of Free Haven Farms. So we prepared a presentation that we're going to do today to talk about why we grow our own food. So some of the things we're going to talk about, first we're going to give our history and our background, or how we got here, how we started Free Haven Farms. And then we'll get into the content. So we'll talk about why we grow our own food, some of the reasons why we started growing our own food, some reasons why you might want to grow your own food. So we'll talk about all these things, from saving money to being healthier, helping the environment. And then we'll get a little bit into how to grow your own food and just some different options that you might have for actually growing some of your own food.
That's me in Connecticut. That's my first garden. Well, not my first garden. It was actually one that I started from the beginning. I was about 10 at the time, but I was kind of born into this. My father always had a big garden in the backyard. And the way that I grew up, the responsibilities, I had chores when I came home from school. I had to either weed, spread some manure, water, harvest something out of the garden before I was allowed to go to the park and play basketball or anything. I had to do my chores first. So it's just something that I kind of learned. I learned how to work hands-on. I learned to get in the dirt, and I learned how to grow food early. I didn't see it as fun then. It was, you know what I'm saying? It was chores. I wanted to go play. Later on, I appreciated it, but at the time it was work, you know. Um, and where it played out later on was when we got married. So, I met Cynthia in Atlanta. I went to Atlanta to get my plumbing license. So I guess to rewind a little bit, starting how I did as a youth, working with my hands, I also started to get a taste for entrepreneurship because my parents didn't have. We grew up in a family with 6 children. All right. My mother raised 2 of her half sisters. We had 8 kids in the house. This is in Connecticut. And so growing food was part of a need too. Like, we really had a big grocery bill that my parents were trying to cut the expense down on. And at the same time, they had, able bodies. They had us as children to work in the garden. So it worked out. But if I wanted to get some sneakers that my mother couldn't afford, she said you had to make the money. You got to figure it out. And so I would shovel in the wintertime when we got a lot of snow. I would shovel driveways and sidewalks and make a few dollars. I would mow lawns and make a few dollars. We used to have a very active community that we went to, a congregation that I grew up in. And in my congregation, one of the members owned a farm. And so I used to work a summer job on his farm. He had a 16-acre farm, family business. And I would work on his farm all summer long. And at that time, I didn't know, but I was getting very early hands-on how to drive a tractor, how to use power tools, use a chainsaw, use a weed whacker, use a lawnmower. I was using all those things as a 12-year-old. I knew how to drive five speed because we had a little truck on the farm that I used to have to get around on. And like I said, I just wanted to make a few dollars so I could buy the things I wanted to that my parents couldn't afford. But what I was getting was an early education as to how to work with my hands, how to be self-sustainable, how to farm, how to be an entrepreneur, and have my own business. I got an early introduction to all that played out later on when we started Free Haven Farms. So when I decided to go to school, I went to a trade school as a high school. It wasn't a normal high school. It was one that I could learn plumbing. So I started to learn plumbing and how to do plumbing as a trade. When I graduated, I was able to go and pursue my career and get a license, and I went to Atlanta to do that. At the time, a lot of houses were being built in Atlanta. This is in 98. And so I went there to make some money and get my plumbing license. And I met Cynthia. And Cynthia was in grad school at Georgia Tech. I'm gonna let her tell her story. But there was something that she was passionate about and some things that I was passionate about that came together, and it started us on our journey to Free Haven Farms that we have now. But I'm gonna let her tell her part where we met in Atlanta.
So I'm Cynthia again, and I'm from New Jersey. I'm from Lawnside. I was born and raised there. I didn't grow up gardening or anything like that, but I was really into math and science. So I was more of a classroom nerd. And so I really loved math and science, but I also was like a Girl Scout. So I had an affinity for being outside and exploring. So when I went to college, I went to Howard University in DC. I studied chemistry. And again, I was really good in the books, but I was more interested in like the environment. So when I graduated from college, I went to Georgia Tech for grad school to study geochemistry. So it's like chemistry, but of the earth. And in particular, at the time, I was interested in marine geochemistry because I wanted the opportunity to go out on the ocean. So I did all my research out on big ships in the middle of the ocean, collecting samples, and doing something that has really nothing to do with farming. But I realized later there was a connection because I was studying, again, the environment. A lot of the things at the time, I started graduate school in 2001. That's when I moved to Atlanta to pursue my PhD at Georgia Tech. And so we were just learning about this thing called global warming. It was still very new at the time, learning about it in school. But I was getting an idea about the different things that we do as humans that are really bad for the environment. And so one of the things that I learned was really bad for the environment, which was not something I was expecting, but it was agriculture. It's one of the worst things that we as humans do to the environment. And we're going to get into a little bit of that today. But while I was studying all these things, I was also living in Atlanta, and I ran into Micaiah. We met and, got dated, got married, and started having children. And so that was my first introduction to this idea of gardening because, again, because what I was learning at school, it was also affecting my personal life because I wanted to eat healthier and I wanted to eat organic food, which again, in the early 2000s was not as common as it is now. So, at the time, like we only shopped at Whole Foods and it was very expensive. I was a graduate student. My husband worked, but we had bought a house, we had a baby. So it was like, this is getting really expensive. And that's what he was telling me, like, hold on, this grocery bill is a little high because you're buying all these organic vegetables. I can grow all this stuff. And I was like, you can what? I had no idea that he could garden, because we were young people. We had apartments when we met. So it just never came up in conversation. I don't know. But he decided that I'm gonna start a garden in our backyard. So I was like, okay, that sounds good. Go do it and I'll cook the food. So that was kind of how this whole gardening thing started with us.
Why we were even into eating healthy, all right? I myself, I had a long journey growing up, and I saw, I'll say, a health holocaust happen in my family. It's about all my aunts got diabetes. One of my aunts had a leg amputated from diabetes. My uncles were on medication for high blood pressure. Some of them were victims of alcoholism. Some of my families were dealing with weight problems and obesity and some of the things that come with that, health issues that come with that, lack of mobility. I had a lot of family members. I had a family member that had contracted AIDS. Um, I just saw a lot of health issues in my family. I saw a lot of my uncles um, die early. Looking back at it now, I didn't know, like, they should have lived longer. You know what I mean? I mean, it hurt me and it affected me and it made me have to dig deeper to understand why, the whys. Like, why is this happening? You know what I'm saying? Why is this happening in my family? Why is this happening within my community like this? And what I did is started to really dig and do research and educate myself and learn. And I would learn from people like, at the time, Dr. Sabi. I would learn from people at the time, Dr. Layla Africa, Queen of Four, and certain people that were very well versed and very knowledgeable in how to heal yourself through food, how to use food as medicine to heal yourself of your ailments, how to use the way that you eat and how you eat, and lifestyle, exercising, lifestyle, drinking more water, lifestyle, getting enough rest, lifestyle, paying attention to what you listen to and what you watch and being around positive people, lifestyle. And I started to learn this and I started to apply it to my own life. And in applying it to my own life, I saw instant changes. I saw instant change. And this was in my 20s that I started to come to this knowledge. And so I had some issues that I was dealing with myself, because of how I was eating. And instantly I had more energy. I had more clarity in my thoughts. I was able to, besides work longer hours, I started to see how even what I was eating was affecting my personality. I was a nicer person. I was more patient, you know what I'm saying, as to when I was drinking 5 cups of coffee a day. And you know what I'm saying? Back then I used to smoke cigarettes and I would eat crazy. I eat McDonald's all day and all night. 5 times a day, McDonald's, I was doing things that was hurting me. I didn't know. So it's just I wasn't exposed to that information. But once I started to educate myself, I started to work it into my life, I saw changes. And I started to tell people, I started to tell my family. And my mother made changes, my father made changes, aunts, uncles. And they were like, yo, Micaiah, like, I'm drinking this alkaline water and I'm feeling a difference. You know what I'm saying? I'm eating fruit every day for breakfast, like you said, and I'm feeling a difference. And so that started the work. That started the vision to say, look, we have to educate our community because the truth is being hidden. Because there's a game going on and we're being played. And there's money that's being made at our expense because they're feeding us the poison and they're feeding us the antidote. And it's the same people that's making money on both ends. And they're keeping us in the dark. And we're dying more and more every year. And so we started to apply. We're like, the best way to teach people is through example. And so we started to make that a way of life, growing our own food. And so we went in the backyard and I told her, yeah, we can grow this thing, Took all the weeds out the backyard and got the soil right, you know, planted up the backyard that year, and we grew so much food. Had to give it away. Couldn't put it in the fridge. Had too much. Had to give it away. And everybody who came to my yard and came back there was amazed. They said, "You did this? In your, who, how?" And so we started to teach people how. This is how you can do it. And you don't have to be a genius, and you don't have to have a lot of money, and you don't have to have a lot of resources, because we didn't have any of those things. But we had our will, you know, and we had a plan, you know. And so we started to execute on it. But one of the first challenges we had is where we started to really understand how our works connected, because in the backyard, it was overran by kudzu. I don't know if you ever heard of kudzu. Kudzu is an invasive weed in the South. We're in Atlanta, Georgia. So this weed will take over everything, grows everywhere. And I was concerned if we can grow food back there, because this kudzu was everywhere. And I didn't want it to take over where we were growing. So I started to try to remove it, but I didn't know enough about it. And Cynthia at the time was doing research on kudzu and different what they call nitrogen fixing plants. So certain plants that take nitrogen out of the air and puts it in the soil. And so I didn't even know, but kudzu made that soil extremely nutritious. It had tons of nitrogen. It made it so that anything I put in there was gonna grow like crazy. Nitrogen, when old school would put manure in the soil, and they say you gotta add manure to the soil, make it grow, the manure is nitrogen. You see, that's how we would get nitrogen in the soil. But there's a natural way, like I said, through nature, that you could achieve that. She showed me. I didn't know. She's like, no, let me educate you. I know nothing about nitrogen fixation. I know nothing about kudzu. All I knew was we threw manure down and we did our thing and it grew good. And so she gave me the science on it. And that's where I realized that when you have the science, you can grow anything anywhere. Anywhere. Even in a park. It don't matter. All you need is the science.
So that was our first garden in Atlanta, and we did that garden, I think, for a couple of years, and then eventually relocated. So I graduated finally, eventually. It was 7 years, but I did have two kids along the way. And then I got my first job at Westchester University in Pennsylvania, right outside of Philly. We relocated to Philly, and we were just renting a row house because, you know, we just left Atlanta, and you know, we had to pick up and move to a whole new city. So we were renting a row house now. So it was a lot smaller than the house that we had in Atlanta, where we had a big yard, you know, garage, the whole thing. And now we're in a row house. And I was like, I don't know if we could do it. Makai's like, nope, I got this. So he did it again. He took our backyard and put in a new garden. And then eventually we had our third child, and we moved to another house in Philly, slightly bigger house. This time we had a front yard and a backyard. Makai planted both of those, and that kind of turned his life from being a gardener on the side to this life in farming, because I entered him into a contest that he didn't even know. PHS, the Pennsylvania Horticulture Society, has this city gardens contest every year where they award like the best vegetable garden, best flower garden, all these things in the city. So I entered him into this contest, and he realized it when the two women came to judge the garden. He's like, who are these people? I was like, oh yeah, because I didn't know what was going to happen. And so they came, they judged the garden, and he actually won first place. And so that kind of was like, the turning point, because he was still, kind of pursuing plumbing and doing gardening on the side. And that was really like the light bulb that said, like, I should really do something with this. He ended up getting a job at a farm in Philly and worked there for many years, moved all the way up to director. And that was when we said at that time, all right, I think we're ready to start our own farm. So after being in Philly for now 7 years, we decided to go back to New Jersey. Well, for me, go back to New Jersey. I was bringing him. I was just dragging him along with me. But he's been a good companion. Because we moved back to my hometown of Lawnside, bought an acre of property, and that was where eventually we started Free Haven Farms. Um, and so our three children who are in the picture, this picture is old because they're now
In
one in
college.
college, like he just left yesterday. And then one about to go to college, another one in 10th grade. But our three children, along with us, have worked Free Haven Farms since, well, we bought the property in 2015, so we've been there now 11 years. And Free Haven Farms has really grown to be, we also leased additional acres. So we're now, a farm that grows food for our community. We distribute most of our food through the food bank at different food pantries. And we teach educational programs in Camden, do school gardens, and in Philly as well. Um, so that's just a journey that kind of got us here.
And Rowan.
Oh, yeah. And I now teach at Rowan, thank you. And have started a new program there, regenerative food systems. So it's not, I don't do exactly geochemistry anymore, but I'm more focused on teaching, college students how to do this regenerative food systems, like within environmental science, but how they can apply that to growing their own food. Now for, you know, everybody that's here that's interested in some aspect of growing your own food, maybe need some convincing why. So some of the things that again were important for us and why we wanted to grow our own food, first and foremost, it was saving money. So when you grow your own food, you can save lots of money. There is a startup cost. I'm not gonna front about that you do have to establish your garden. But once you get it going, you're harvesting and you're saving your own seeds and replanting them year after year. Then you get into where you're really saving at the end of the year hundreds, maybe even thousands of dollars. You can plant fruit trees and really reduce the food that you're buying at the grocery store. So that was what got us into it. And then you can grow the things specifically that you like to eat. So there are people that, like specific things that you can't always find at the grocery store, especially cultural items that may not be as widely available. So if you can't find it, you can grow it. All right. One of the things that we love that's in the background of all these slides is okra. And okra, again, we started growing food in Atlanta. I never, ever had okra growing up in New Jersey. Like, my family's been in New Jersey for generations. So we don't have, the same like Southern cuisine. It wasn't until I moved to Atlanta that I even tasted okra and then started growing it and was like, wow, I love okra. So you can't always find it though at the grocery store. So that's one of the things that we grow. Micaiah likes really, really spicy peppers. So he started to grow some of those. He even makes his own hot sauce during the season. So those are some of the
Like hot.
things that, again, we were like, we can't find them all the time, so grow your own. And that's what, when people always ask, what should I grow? We always tell them, well, what do you eat? That's what you should grow. In terms of what you can grow in this climate. So that's the only caveat, is that we can't grow tropical stuff. Um, and then when you grow these vegetables, you're more likely to eat them. And that sounds really basic, but it's true. So when you're growing your own food, you tend to eat healthier, and especially with children. So when children are involved, when our children were involved, well, they're still involved. We just have to pay them now, but they are still involved in the farm. But when they're involved in that process of planting the seed, watering it, watching it grow from week to week, and then you finally bring it in, they're a lot more excited to eat that food. So we definitely see a lot of, not just in our family, but people in general, when they start growing their own food, they always say, I'm eating a lot healthier now, right? You're eating a more diverse selection. Maybe when you go to a grocery store, you're buying the same vegetables every week, and it kind of gets into a rut. And now you can explore more with different options. And then it just gets you outside. right? You get to reconnect with nature. I mean, all the benefits of being outside, getting vitamin D from the sun, putting your hands in the soil is like shown to release the, positive endorphins in your body and actually help with your mood. There's so many benefits to being outside, getting fresh air and moving your body, right? When you're gardening, you're stretching, you're reaching, you're carrying, you're doing all these things. Like Micaiah said, we've influenced our family. So my mom, when I was growing up, only really did flowers in the yard, but she's now started gardening. So now at 80 years old, every summer she gets out there and she plants a few things, but that keeps her extremely active in the summer, where otherwise, she wouldn't be as active. So I definitely encourage people to get outside just to help with physical activity, movement, different things like that.
Right on. I just wanted to add a little bit to a couple of those things. One, definitely in terms of saving money. Cynthia mentioned that there's a little bit of expense. The expense is really just on the setup. It's kind of a one-time thing. I'm not gonna say there's a little expense on the set, but once you get your system set up, there's not really too much more that you got to worry about in terms of investing in money. It's more, the investment is sweat equity. That's what we call it. So it's the work that you put in. That's the part that's where you're gonna make your payment. All right, and your investment. Another thing I just like what Cynthia was speaking about just now, the therapy of growing your own food. There's a lot of therapy that comes with gardening and being outside. Um, there's been studies, like she said, that show when you put your hands in the soil, there's literally a bacteria, micro something vaca. I can't pronounce it all the way, but anyways, this bacteria, it releases. They said it's the equivalent of people that take Prozac to a medication to help stabilize their mood. It is the equivalent of that effect on us when we put our hands in the dirt and when we work the soil. And not to mention, sun and fresh air. And I tell you, once upon a time, you got to know that years ago, gardening, farming was common. Most older people that I talk to have worked on a farm, been on a farm, come from a farm. Can you put your hand up if you've ever worked on a farm or been on a farm or okay, yeah. And so it's a certain generation that I'm seeing. And in my generation, I have peers, that I'm about to be 50 years old. I have peers that are in their 50s and they've transitioned. They're not here anymore. And I look and I talk with older people that come from a different generation that were active. You understand? They worked on farms. They worked with their hands. They put their hands in the dirt outside, and they still here, kicking, strong, moving, sitting, listening, learning. And I know that comes from a certain lifestyle that they've been blessed to experience for years on end. A certain kind of food that you've been able to eat that, I worry about this younger generation that is given iPhones and artificial intelligence. And they don't go outside. They don't move around. And it's a certain lifestyle that they're being given that we know down the road is gonna have detrimental effects. So that's why it's very important for us to buy into this and to share it with the younger generation, our grandchildren, our children. Being able to get outside and plant something with them is showing them a way that if we don't do it, it could be lost. And we want to keep this way of life, this lifestyle alive still.
What they've shown in studies is that the food that we eat today has a lot less nutrients than the food that was grown 50, 100 years ago. I mean, we're talking about a huge decrease. So they say you have to, what, 8 oranges?
Six to eight
6 to 8
oranges.
oranges to equal the same amount of vitamin C from like 1950.
And 50 is not that long ago.
And that's not that long ago, right? So that says a lot about the state of our food system, even if you are eating healthy, right? You're going to the store, you're buying, you're making your salad, you're eating your fruit every day. Well, you're not getting the same nutrition that you think you're getting because the quality of our food has decreased so much. And it's because of the quality of the soil, right?
Yeah.
So all the nutrients that we need, we get from our food, but all the nutrients in the food come from the soil. But our soil has been degraded. Again, one of the really bad parts of agriculture is that it degrades the soil through erosion, through using chemicals, things like that. So when you're growing your own food, you can make sure, right, that you're putting the healthy, compost, and you have good nutritious soil. You can add things to your soil so that the food that you're growing has those nutrients that you intend for it to have, right? You're eating spinach to get the iron, right? And we think we're getting that when we're eating spinach from the store, but it is not providing us with that iron.
Because when you're
Right.
growing your own food, you have your garden, there's not a whole lot of hands that are touching it, like when it's in the grocery store. And the other reason why the nutrient is less from the grocery store is because they harvest things early. They harvest them early so that they can travel for a week, sit in the shelf for a week, be around in your pantry for a week before you eat it. So they harvest it early. Now, when you're growing your own food, you're not going to harvest it. You're going to harvest it when it's ready to pick. You're going to harvest it when you're ready to eat. And that tomato that you let get sun ripened is going to have more nutrients because the sun fed it. It gave it its nutrients. That orange that you eat that's really orange, wait to pick it when it's really orange, it's gonna have more nutrients than that orange that was picked green and it traveled 3 weeks and when you got it, it was finally orange. No, it's two different things. And so it's little nuances like that that come with growing your own, supporting local farmers, going to farmers markets, things like that, that make that nutrient in your food higher.
Going into history just a little bit, not to get into one of my classes that I teach, but again, the huge impact that agriculture has on the environment really started about 100 years ago. So again, if you think about, even like, prehistorically, everyone had to grow their own food. And even when there were designated farmers, it was for the community. So the pressure that was on your typical farmer was a lot less. All right. So when we look at farmers going back to like 1960, they were growing enough food for about 26 people. All right. 26 families. All right. So that's a much smaller amount. Now the average farmer can feed, over 100 people. And that's because of the pressure that just our growing population put on farmers, but also, not to get too much into it, but how much our farms have been consolidated in the US, right? There used to be a lot more smaller family farms. Now you have a lot bigger farms.
Corporations.
Yeah, they're owned by a corporation. So that changed, but really the explosion in our population, right, that happened globally, like turn of the 20th century, previous century, really put pressure on how much food needed to be grown. And so that started what's called the Green Revolution, although it sounds like it's a good thing. That was the introduction of pesticides and fertilizers. All right, so these chemicals that we introduced into our food system helped food grow faster and bigger to feed more people. But we learned later on how bad that was for the environment. All right, so pesticides, really quickly, those are chemicals used to kill pests, mainly insects, fungus, weeds, things like that. So you have the herbicides to kill the weeds, you have the insecticides that kill the insects, you have the fungicides to kill the fungus. And again, they were introduced like around 1930s and really became widespread in the 50s. And so there's been a whole evolution of different pesticides and fertilizers that were used. But now, kind of fast forward, 21st century, A couple of the biggest pesticides that are used are Roundup and atrazine. All right, Roundup is your common, you can find that at Walmart, Home Depot. You can spray it to kill weeds in your yard, but it's also used on farms around the world. And it's used as an herbicide to kill weeds on farms.
Like, I don't want to go on a whole doomsday tirade on this stuff, but it's dismal, the conversation, because this information isn't given to us. You're talking about billion dollar corporations that pay a lot of money for this information to be suppressed, you know, because if people knew, then they would say stuff about it. They would protest it. We're talking about billions of pounds of this stuff being sprayed. They don't spray it just for pesticides and stuff. They spray it on produce to help. They say dry it. They spray it on produce. They say to help it ripen quicker. They spray it on everything. And the problem is it ends up in the water system. The problem is the research that's been done to show its effect on our health, and we're being exposed to it at levels that we couldn't imagine. And so it is something that we have to talk about because it's the truth. And although it's hard to think about, we have to know that. One thing that I would encourage everyone to check out is a YouTube documentary. It's right here, Chemical Farming, The Loss of Human Health by Dr. Zach Bush. He was a medical surgeon. He's a doctor who did extensive research on extensive case studies for years and years on these chemicals that are being used in agriculture, and the studies that he found in his patients, and a direct correlation with when these chemicals were introduced into our system of agriculture, and at the same time when these health ailments we have in our society started to spike and really increase. And we're talking about everything that ranges from Alzheimer's and Parkinson's to autism, that have affected our communities in huge ways and can really be tied back to these chemicals that we're being exposed to on very high levels. If it doesn't say organic, it's got some of this stuff on it, period. And that's hard to know, but that's a fact. Even if it has the label, you're hoping and you're praying. But yes, there is standards and regulations that go into organic to make sure that those farms that are certified organic cannot, do not, will not use these chemicals, as well as we'll talk about in a second, bioengineering, GMO. That's another conversation. We're talking about what's being applied topically to your stuff. Now we're gonna have solutions. That's why we're not gonna just deal with the dark side. We got solutions that we're gonna be talking about today that we can do to counter this problem. But we have to be real about what it is. If you don't address the problem, you can't come up with the solution, you know? And so that's why we have to have this conversation.
The introduction of these chemicals, well, it started in like the 70s, but really peaked in around the 90s. And so this documentary kind of goes through that timeline. But if we look at, these spikes, and these ailments have always been there. There's always been autism and Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and things like that. But we've seen cases dramatically increase in recent years. And I don't think that can be disputed. And so this is, one correlation that has been made that, can really affect how we're interacting with our food.
We always say that people should be able to make informed decisions, and we all have to make our own personal decisions about food. But the thing is, if you're not given the information, then how are you going to make an informed decision? You're just going to do what's marketed, and they're marketing in a way that makes you think that, listen, man, the dentists used to market cigarettes. They used to market cigarettes. Doctors used to market cigarettes as healthy. This used to happen, and people used to smoke them because it was marketed. So we gotta be careful with the marketing and just look at like I said, we're giving this so we can make informed decisions.
And so they've really done studies to show the links between not just, what they're showing in this video, but also to cancers. And so there's lawsuits. You see it on daytime television all the time. If you've been exposed to Roundup, call this number. Those things are real because there is a lawsuit, that's billions of dollars that is still being claimed that is partly because of people's exposure to Roundup and that it has caused cancer. So those are one of the pesticides, but we really should feel that way about all of them, right? So when we see the other one, atrazine, how much it gets used, and this is since 1997, a lot of it is in the Midwest. But again, this is where all of the corn and the wheat that ends up in our food is grown. So whether we're eating, these things directly, we have to understand that these products, the corn especially, is in almost everything that we eat. And the corn is being sprayed with this atrazine that has, again, been shown to have really negative effects on our health. And so it's hard to see this picture. Oh, sorry. Microphone. It was hard to see this picture, but this is showing some water that's just completely green with algae, and that's because of fertilizers. So not to get too into how that happens, but just understanding the impact that these fertilizers have on our environment. They don't have the same impact as the pesticides. Pesticides are chemicals that kill other organisms. So that's why they're going to impact our health, right? They're going to eventually, even though we're not an insect or a tiny, fungus, these chemicals still over time impact our health. The fertilizers don't have that same impact because the fertilizers, those are chemicals that help things grow faster. But what that does is it makes other things grow faster in the environment, like algae. So that has a really negative effect on our water because we can have these water systems like the Gulf of Mexico every year has these huge algae blooms that cover all of the water. And it basically kills all of the fish in that water. And so that has an impact on our health, indirectly because that's the food that we eat, right? So if you're eating fish, you're eating seafood, that environment where they grow is being impacted by these fertilizers. One of the other issues that we've brought up are GMO crops. So if you're not familiar with GMO, stands for genetically modified organism. And the definition of that is any organism whose genome has been engineered in the laboratory in order to favor the expression of desired physiological traits or the generation of desired biological products. So that's a mouthful. But what we understand about these crops, these GMO crops, is that they are being, again, like designed in the laboratory. So we're not talking about things that are cross-pollinated in nature, but things that are designed in the laboratory. And they're usually designed to either naturally resist the pest or the pesticide. Many of these crops that we see, and sometimes to also have other characteristics. So the tomato, that was the first GMO crop to be introduced in 1994, and it was called the Flavor Saver, and it was so that the tomato would retain its, color and its flavor throughout the growing season. So it would resist frost and it would resist, tomatoes are very finicky, right? They'll bruise easily. So they need a specific temperature when you're growing tomatoes. They like warmer temperatures. So this tomato was able to grow in colder temperatures and it wouldn't die off. All right. So that tomato, again, was introduced in 1994. And we've seen now so many more crops come on the market that have.
Tell them how they what they injected in there.
Yeah, so what they did was they injected the DNA of an Arctic fish that had the genes that naturally resisted cold. They injected that specific gene into the tomato. All right, so it's not that it would taste fishy, right? But it would have those characteristics that the Arctic fish has that make it naturally cold resistant.
The problem with genetically modified organisms is kind of in the word. You know, there's been a modification of the genetics. All right, so they got in the laboratory and they changing the DNA, the chromosomes, the biomolecular structure of these fruits and vegetables, in a way that, you know, research that they've done, a lot of studies outside of the U.S. have shown that it leads to a lot of times cancerous effects. The problem really with GMO is that they're designing most of these things to be resistant to the pesticides that they're spraying. So the same company that sprays the pesticides will make the seeds genetically modified to resist the pesticide. And anything else that's sprayed on that with that pesticide will die, except for those seeds that have been modified. And now, once you use, now they'll put a patent on these, and you're not allowed to resell them. The way that the USDA is set up, that's real sketchy, is that they'll give subsidies. They'll give a lot of money to farmers per acre to use the seeds that they're pushing. So farmers will be at a loss because it's hard to make money farming. But if they use the specific seeds that they're told, they can get money back to make money for the year. So they'll feel that pressure. And even though morally they may feel like, I'm not really with this, because they financially have to survive, a lot of them will start using genetically modified seeds and in turn start spraying the chemicals, because that's the only way that they can get their money. And it puts pressure because that same subsidy, that same money isn't available for small scale farmers or for farmers that are growing organically or regeneratively and not using those pesticides. So when you're sitting there wondering, like, why are farmers doing this? Like, they should know better. Understand that this is the way that the system's set up. And a lot of them are cornered and they don't have any choice. But the more that we have small scale farmers, the more people, like we're saying, that grow their own food and communities that are doing this, then it's less pressure on the big farmers to produce, you know, food to feed the masses.
Again, there are more crops that have been added to the list. Everything that we buy at the grocery store isn't GMO. So again, this isn't to scare us about what food is available, but just to inform. Some of the crops that are, you know, available as GMO is, of course, corn, summer squash, and again, that's to the summer squash are really susceptible to a certain fungus. And so they've developed a squash that is resistant to that fungus. Soybeans, cotton, papaya, squash, canola, sugar beets are also on that list. And so they've also added salmon to the list. So right now, salmon is the only meat that you can buy that is also genetically modified. And
now they call it bioengineered.
Yeah, so that's what they basically changed to bioengineered. And GMO apples are also available. So the apples and potatoes that are available are have been engineered to not brown after you cut them. You know, you cut an apple and about 5 minutes later, it's gonna have a little brown, it starts to oxidize. I don't care about that, but people do. Same with the potatoes. You cut them and they brown within a couple of minutes. And they don't brown. But that's the thing. They're on the market. But they have since now changed the labeling because people got hip to the GMO and started to avoid buying that at the grocery store. So in 2022, I think the law came out in 2017, but it was implemented in 2022. I remember because it was still like during pandemic times. And they changed it to bioengineered. So that's the new label, and you will see it on certain foods, but then they also replaced it with a QR code. So where there's a labeling requirement, they don't always write it on the food. They'll just have a QR code that says, scan this to learn more about your food, something, something.
Which makes it difficult.
Which makes it difficult because you literally have to sit there in the grocery store and scan the box of food to find out. Nobody's doing all that. So it's just a way to adhere to the rules, but kind of skirt around them so that, because again, people are becoming more aware and trying to avoid things that are labeled as bioengineered or GMO. So these are things that we have to be aware of when we're shopping.
Just to be aware when you're shopping, because lots of times you'll have the option and they'll have it labeled, and you can get conventional, you know what I'm saying? You can get organic and you can get GMO, you know, bioengineered or genetically modified. And so there's just levels to it, you know what I'm saying? Sometimes, and you got to do the best you can with what you have, you know what I'm saying? Trust me, we've been in situations that we like, you know, we're going to go through a list later on called the Dirty Dozen.
That's right here.
Okay, all right, boom. So boom. Here's what they call the Dirty Dozen or the Clean 15. So these are the ones that fruits and vegetables that through testing have shown to have the highest level of pesticides on them most of the time. Strawberries, spinach, kale, nectarines, apples, grapes, peaches, cherries, pears, tomatoes, celery, potatoes. And they don't have lettuce on here, but that should be the top of the list. Lettuce is really high. All right. And so with these here, especially things like lettuce and spinach and, you know, your greens, that the pesticides are sprayed directly to the leaves. There's no shell on it. There's nothing that covers it. And then you look at the Clean 15, you know, avocados, you know, corn, pineapples, onions. There's a shell that covers over those. You know what I'm saying? There's a covering on those avocados and the corn. And so a lot of these things right here have protection from some of those pesticide exposures. Some of them, in the way that they're grown, pesticides is hardly used because they don't really deal with insects or some of the other things that some of the other things on the Dirty Dozen will deal with. Because they don't deal with them, they don't spray them. So these are less likely to have as much pesticides as some of the things on this list. And they add to this list. This list kind of gets changed every year. So that's something that you could always look up, see what's the Clean 15 for 2026 and what's the Dirty Dozen for 2026. And there's companies that do these tests on these vegetables to tell us which ones are the safest ones to kind of move with. But if you are, you know, like I said, there's been points in time that we couldn't get everything organic that we wanted to in the store. So we might get some oranges that were conventional. We might get some bananas that were conventional, knowing that we're gonna peel the skin off of them, and we weren't gonna just bite into it like an apple. And they're a little bit more protected. So that would be a way for me to go there and say, hey, I can't afford organic, but I could afford these conventional, but I'm not gonna get the GMO because I know that's been altered at the chromosome level. Like I don't know what they put in that, but so that's just ways that we can make informed decisions.
Again, these are just tips when you're shopping of things that you can buy that are going to be a little bit better for your health, better for the environment. Again, the Dirty Dozen, basically things that you should always buy organic if possible. because they do have the highest level pesticides. They test like 40, I think it said 47 different fruits and vegetables, and they rank them. So these are the ones, the top 12 that have the most levels of trace pesticides in them. And then this is the bottom of the list. Um, and so there's other things in the middle, but basically this tells you what you should buy organic, and then the clean 15 are things that you don't have to worry about as much. The solution that we're trying to pitch is to grow your own food. And so this is a picture, again, don't know how well you can see it, but this is a picture of that front yard. This was the first place garden, by the way, in Philly, in our row house in Philly, that Micaiah planted. And it is a very small, 10 by 10 front yard. And he basically turned that into different rows. So we were growing, I mean, our entire front yard was just a garden. And I still drive around Philly now and see people with their front yards and the whole thing is a garden. I'm always like,
Camden
so
too.
happy. In Camden too, we
And
see.
Pennsauken. I've been around. You know, we do a lot of work. We do a lot of work in Camden, and Camden doesn't get enough respect for the amount of gardens that are in Camden. I drive around Camden, and any part I'm in, there's folks growing food, man, in their little tiny front yard, in their little tiny backyard. They done put the soil in there, using up every single little space of that. So people raising chickens in Camden. Look, man, I see it. You know what I'm saying? And that's the thing, is if there's a will, there's a way. You know, and so a lot of us, you know, we might have situations better than that. We have a little bit more space to move around and stuff. So I get inspiration from people that are doing it with less, you know, and in hard situations and making it happen. So, you know, yeah, just know that it can be done. You know, this was a little front yard, or what she didn't talk about was across the street there was a vacant lot. I took that over too. And that's where I grew a lot of stuff. And the way I did that, it was just being overgrown. And it's like, there's someone owns that property, and if they don't cut the grass and stuff, they'll get a fine by the city. So I found out who it was. I was like, listen, you know, I cut the lawn twice already. So you might as well just let me take over it. I'm gonna keep it cut, but I want to grow some stuff. All right, I got some garden. I'm gonna grow some stuff. I keep it maintained so you won't get a ticket, because somebody might call on you. So he let me go ahead and take it over, and I grew up all this stuff on that vacant lot, and I grew so much on that vacant lot. And I'm just saying, I took the initiative. You know what I'm saying? I had the will. You know, it's just there's resources around. You know, when we look at it with intention, we can see how, you know, we might be able to have a little container garden right in our little front yard, or a little windowsill and getting some sun. Might be able to put a little container there and grow a little something, you know. And it's just about getting started.
So this second picture is from the farm, but I wanted to show these vertical towers that that Micaiah built and we planted up. So the vertical towers are another way that you can grow in limited space, because you're growing everything that you would maybe in a row, but you're growing it vertically. So you can put that on a patio or a deck, something like that. Or if you just have a smaller area in your yard, you can still grow, but you're using your vertical space. So that's another option. I mean, we grew stuff out of the top, we grew out of the sides. I don't know if you can see, there are like heads of lettuce. We had carrots, I think some kale. There were tomatoes growing out of this one, because there's two in the picture. And so we just had a lot of different things growing in this one tower. So all along the sides and in the top, and we had two of them next to each other. Again, the vertical towers, this is another picture of them. We have raised beds, so you can build a raised bed and grow in a raised bed, and that can be beneficial, again, depending on your space, also depending on the soil that you might have. When I was a professor at Westchester, the research that I did was on lead contamination in soils, because Philly in particular has a problem, still has a problem with lead contamination in the soil. And so that can affect you. If you're gardening in your backyard and you have lead in your soil, then now you've taken an activity that's supposed to be beneficial and healthy, and now you're actually exposing yourself to this toxin. So that was the research that I did. And so the solution to that was you can still grow food, but in a raised bed, right? So you're not growing in the ground. You bring in your own soil, and then you can have it contained and away from the toxic soil. So that's another option. This is in ground. This is another, or I think this was the one across the street, or this is our front yard.
Yeah, one of our Philly gardens
This is
for
a
sure.
Philly garden. That was our daughter, and she was really, really young. But again, we had corn growing in the front yard, different leafy greens, all sorts of stuff. But that was in ground. But you can also grow using hydroponics. We'll talk more about this in later weeks when we come back. But you can grow using hydroponics. You can use that indoor, so that you don't need any outdoor space to grow that way. So that's another option if you either don't have the space, if you have an apartment, or you just want to try something different. You can grow using hydroponics indoor. And then you could also have a small greenhouse. So again, I've seen people with greenhouses, really small ones you can buy like at Lowe's or Home Depot and put in your yard. And that'll allow you to grow kind of in a longer season. So some people grow all year round in their greenhouse that they have. But these are all different options. They don't need a huge amount of space. You can put right in your backyard, and will allow you to grow food, you know, depending on what you're interested in growing. Again, you can grow tropical stuff in a greenhouse in New Jersey. So we've seen it done. People growing citrus trees and different things like that.
In New Jersey, we can grow, like we'll start planting around March, so we'll plant for March and April and May, June, July, August, September, October, November. We're still planting. We usually stop our harvest after Thanksgiving. So it's like December, January, February are kind of our down months. But for most of the year, you can grow in this area what you need to eat. In the springtime, when we get started, is a lot of our cold tolerant crops. Is a lot of the leafy greens that we like to eat, and we grow that all year round. But we start right there in March growing kale, lettuce, arugula, spinach, Swiss chard, collard greens, bok choy, cabbage. We love to eat all those greens, and we grow them all at that point in time. We grow them all the way until the end of the year. We grow those crops all the way through the end of the year. We have certain things that are summer crops that we don't start putting in the ground until the end of April, May. We'll put certain things in the ground around May. Now, the workshops that we do, we're going to be giving y'all seedlings because we work with greenhouses. They're starting plants for us right now. We get hundreds of plants, baby seedlings that you could transplant right into your garden, right into your container. So we'll give you a head start on it. So we really encourage y'all to come out to some of our workshops. But like Cynthia said, and just so you know, like we do things to preserve and we're going to talk about this in some of our other workshops. So the months we don't grow food, we preserve stuff. So we're harvesting through November, especially in a way to store for the winter. So we'll put a lot of our greens in 1-gallon Ziploc bags. We'll put them in our deep freezer, and we'll use them throughout the year. Everyone's bought frozen vegetables before. That's all it is. It's harvested and frozen right away. When you harvest it and freeze it right away, you can preserve all the nutrients in there for the most part. You lose very little nutrients. So if you're planning accordingly, you can literally harvest, grow, harvest, and store and get through the year on your own, like with the things that you like to eat the most. It can be done, and you don't need a lot of space to do it. If you have a family of 8 people that you're feeding, it might be a little bit more that you have to grow. But if it's just 2, 1, 2, 3 people, you can do a lot in a very little space.